yourself comfortable? What would be?
You want my chair?
Yes, of course she wants your chair. It's sort of a stool over. Well, it depends where y'all are going to sit. So.
On the ladder, up the ladder.
I don't speak from on high. If you're comfortable there.
Would you like a little chair and table type of thing, or
not at all?
What's your?
I'm quite comfortable with this. And the topic of the conversation tonight is ini, or inismo, and this is an Italian movement that is, in order to give it an ism, like socialism, communism, capitalism, it is inism, and the INI at the beginning stands for three words that are central to their program. And so the first is international, and I'm translating from the Italian, but international, and that's an important concept for the movement because, in fact, it is based in Italy, but has American participants. It has people in France, Spain, Latin America. There's a very prolific Brazilian contingency, and so it is truly international in that sense. And then the second letter, the N, is for novatrice, which is really a variation of the term suggesting innovation. So it's international, doing innovations, and then the I that follows is infinitesimale, which looks like it could mean infinitesimal, but in English we tend to think of infinitesimal as being infinitesimally small, and their intention with the word is that it goes to infinity, and so it's expanding this international innovation. And so that's, in a nutshell, that's the kind of concepts that they're going for. And this movement started in Paris, where a lot of good things start. And in 1980, the founders got together in a cafe and thought up this idea. And 25 years later, they went back to the same cafe with a crowd of followers, and so they were quite pleased with the success that they had in 25 years. And they, of course, like all movements in literature, published manifestos, and their first manifesto is simply called What is Inismo? And it lays out some principles that I'll identify here. And you'll be able to see from these that they're really looking for an opportunity to break down the rules and go off into, well, yonder, so to speak. So it says, poetry is not necessarily a written page. So it could be a gesture, it could be pictures, any of this could be poetry. Poetry can also be seen or heard. And so poetry is, again, not something that one recites necessarily, or not something that one reads necessarily, but any of those. Poetry is also scent and gesture. And so we could have poetry of perfumes, an idea that's always tempted people from the symbolist poets in the end of the 19th century were enchanted with that idea of adding fragrances to any artistic performance. And then a sonnet can be hypergraphic and rhyme, like a drawing. And last night we were talking about some examples of poems, such as one by Apollinaire, which shows a fountain and the streams of water were spraying, but it was nevertheless a sonnet. Another one that comes to mind along those lines is a poem after the launch of lunar missions that was called Moonshot Sonnet, and it had the 14 lines, but the lines were not words, but rather the symbols that appeared on viewfinders of equipment looking at the moon. And so it was the Moonshot Sonnet with the shapes rhyming with each other rather than with words. And another principle is that the poet can use at his whim the pen, the brush, the computer, the mallet, as they have sculptors doing this, tape or film, so that all the media can come into inism as well. And then finally, they say every word, no matter how old it is, will be used for the first time. Because their idea is to refresh and allow freedom in expression of these things. A movement like this doesn't come out of nowhere. This is talking about starting in 1980 with inism, but the origins can be traced way back in the history of writing and poetry. But in more recent history, movements like all the avant-gardes of the 20th century, in Europe anyway, tend to look to some 19th century predecessors, and in particular Baudelaire, who was the first modern poet in many people's view, because he would look at ugly things, and one of my favorites is a poem where he looks at a decaying carcass and says, "Oh, shall I compare you to a decaying carcass?" And goes on, it's not a summer's day, but rather a modernly repulsive image. And then they look at Rimbaud, another symbolist poet who, in one of his poems that's most admired by these people, called Vowels, he takes the vowels and gives color and sound and implicit meaning to each of them, so that he's breaking the letters of the alphabet away from the typical strain of poetry. He didn't actually do any of that in his own poetry in terms of writing just with letters, but he inspired his followers. And then Mallarmé, who was a poet who his famous poem in this regard is called "A Throw of the Dice Will Not Abolish Chance," and he wrote the poem so that words on the page would look first like a 3 on the dice and then a 4 on the dice, which also looks like a Big Dipper if you line them up right. And so he's actually breaking the whole idea of poetry being lines in a straight line across the page and saying they could be mattered anywhere. Sometimes they stick in Apollinaire, who did his calligrams, or they go to Tristan Tzara, associated with Dada, where they said that words could be nothing. Nothing could be poetry. And then these people also graciously go on to letterism. And letterism is a French movement that started after World War II. And one of the first principles of letterism was that you can take a letter and from the letter build your artwork. And in one of the early statements by the letterist leader, he said, he was teaching a painting class, and he said, forget all the other shapes and colors and stuff, just write M on the painting. And I mistook that the first time I saw it, because the text said, just write M ... on the canvas. Well, M ... actually is being nice about not saying male. And so he said, just write shit on the canvas and that'll be your painting. So they were, of course, trying to break away from the beautiful salon paintings of the French tradition or the Impressionists and say, put this word there, and that the word made up of letters becomes the poem. And same thing with oral recited poetry. And they actually did concerts in jazz clubs where they would get there and say these poems that were things like ka-ka-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. And you get the idea. It's just the sounds of the individual letters, and there are so-called invented letters like oh. So they think we invented a new letter. Babies invent that every day. So those are some of the inspirations, and letterism, again, as far as inismo is concerned, letterism starts out being the home base of Mr. Bertozzi, Gabriele Aldo Bertozzi, who exhibits. He's Italian, but he knows French real well. He's a specialist on Rimbaud, and he exhibits with the lettrists, and then at some point, well, in the 1980s, starts feeling, oh, I could do this myself, and moves on to found letterism in Paris, but then they have a second meeting with another manifesto in a town named Sant'Apollinaro, which sounds like Holy Apollinaire, referring back to the French poet. And from then on, it became an Italian movement. 20 years ago, I became, or maybe 30 years ago, I started being involved with the lettrist movement and spent a long time in their camp until finally I was seduced away into inismo for a couple of reasons. And this relates to the whole strategy of artistic movements, is that someone once said of lettrism, comparing it with inismo, that it was the same religion but with different popes. And the pope of lettrism is Isidore Isou, and it kind of reminds me of surrealism, where André Breton, the founder, became the one who would say to Aragon, you're not a surrealist anymore, because they had some differences. Isou was the same way. His co-founder, in a way, was Maurice Lemaitre, and then they got into it. And by the time I knew Isou, he was saying, that man whose name I can't pronounce, because they were so mad at each other. Well, Bertozzi became the same kind of outcast for the lettrists, and he went off and did his independent thing. Bertozzi had a big difference in that he wanted to really free people. And we have a good illustration here of how that can work out, because Paul Lambert, sitting here, was involved with the inismo movement and became acquainted with Bertozzi, who then said, you can do, in America, you can do inismo the way you want to, and even named him, dubbed him, King of Ini, USA, which was a way of saying, you know, I'm not really the Pope or the ruler of all inismo, but different branches can do different kinds of things.
But I advocated, because being a king is not an American, thing. So I'm actually a retired king. So I'm like the Queen Mother, unfortunately, who's dead. I'm not dead, but I'm in the background waving, and I go to all the dinners and stuff.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, another difference between the lettrists and Ini is that the Italians give better parties. They do big celebrations, and part of what makes that so good is that they invite people from all over the world, us for instance, to join in with their festivities and exhibit with them. And the letrists became more and more ingrown. They spent more of their energy defending themselves from attacks, or from the fact that they think somebody stole their idea. Whereas the inismo says, take my idea, run with it. And so that's part of the encouraging sign. And you could tell that, now the letrists are dying off and there are no young letrists. But there are young inismo people. There's surely some younger than Paul and me. And so,
That was weird that you pointed to Paul when you said that.
well, compared to me. That's weird, huh?
I'm gonna go
Actually, that was
outside
pretty
and
weird.
see if I can tell some people that there's free wine. Well, look, at some people
hey,
can't.
dude.
But there's just some people on the sidewalk that think that free wine.
Come on in.
Don't you think that if I went out and told some of the people on the sidewalk there's free
We're
wine?
getting to the show and tell part of it, so you might as well have a glass of wine. I'm a university professor, and my specialty is French, and I do international studies and some seminars on various topics. So you'll pardon me if I say we're going to have a quick review now. So ini, I-N-I, is I. The first I is for international, which is it's a movement with members in Brazil, and Argentina, Spain, Italy, even the United States. N for novatrice, which means innovation. And innovation goes along with this list of all these things we said in the poetry. It doesn't have to stay on the page. It can explode. It can be movement. It can be perfumes. And then the third one is infinitesimale, meaning infinitely small, no, spreading out to infinity. And so it's movement of freedom in art. I have to admit that there's also a playful quality to this, and frankly, one of the things I like about associating with all these avant-garde movements is that it's full of wackos. There's Paul, for instance. There's B. Actually, I'm less wacko than most of them, but they do off-the-wall things. And so here's one of the things. Ini, I-N-I, is an ending that appears on a lot of words. Fettuccine and so on. And so I made this homage to some of the Italian ini people, and I did it in the form of a menu, plasticized, and it says food at the ini restaurant. And I did these combination pictures, and they keep having manifestos. I have a couple of copies. They're in Italian, but they'll say, okay, now here's the manifesto of ini photography. And it says in photography, you can blend words and other images together in your photograph. And so this one has ini wheats, the cereal box, that's the breakfast at the ini cafe. And then we go to the hors d'oeuvre. We have an hors d'oeuvre or antipasto of pepperoncini. And after that we have the specialty of the house, which is rossatini. And all of these I've included pictures. There's Bertozzi, the leader. And on these images, there are also little symbols that are my personal signs and alphabet that I've adapted from American Indian petroglyphs. Because coming from this continent, I thought I should introduce something American. And here's another fellow. The second course is fettuccine, and it's Da Vinci brand. And what do we have next? Oh, cannellini. Amazing how many ini products there are in the world. White kidney beans. And for dessert, that's the brand Parrozzini, and one of the lovely women involved in the movement. And then there's the summary at the end. And so this is typical of some of the kinds of things. For the ini people, you say, is that a poem? And the response is that it doesn't have to be a poem. It's an ini work. And there's something a little childish about all of this. They're inventing words for it. So the basic ini painting, which has letters and images, is an inia. That would be an inia, right? Yeah.
Well, that's kind of an appropriated artwork.
Okay, so what he has done here is simply taking a painting that existed already and writing inism on it. And for the inists, what this does is, and it's a little bit like the situationist idea of détournement, of redirecting the painting and putting that nicely reflected in the lake name.
But it's also, that lake is Lost Lake up by and they call the letterist movement the unknown avant-garde. And I think of the Innis movement as the lost, nobody's ever heard of the Innis movement. And also that's dated, I think, 1846. So it's theoretically the oldest Innis art body. That's what I think.
There it is, right in front of you. Then, so this would be called an Inica Fotografia, and they have Inica Video and Inica Theater and Film, etc. So they've thought of quaint names, but there's an important reason for that, which is that these works no longer fit the standard categories of artistic expression. And so in order to enable us to talk about it, we have to use some of these other terms. Now, I knew we'd be a small group where we could pass some things around, and so I just printed out some examples of kinds of things that people have done. And these come from the INI website, where there's a list of artists in different countries. And here, by gosh, here's a rubber ferry. And I'll just pass this around. And here's a piece by Paul Lambert. Here's something by Kiki Franceschi, an Italian woman, and the one I'm particularly interested in is on the left, where it's a book done as sort of a what do you call that, fold, sort of like a screen that is able to stand up. And then I have three works by Angelo Mirante. And Angelo was the first English artist whom I met. I corresponded with Bertozzi, who was not available, and he had Angelo meet me in Rome and show me his apartment. And Angelo, while we were sitting in a cafe in Rome, said, I'm going to do an oral poem as a welcome to David, to me. And so he sits there, and we recorded this. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the MP3 while looking to get ready for this lecture, but It went something like, Ina, Homa, Davide. That was his welcome to me. And it was interesting to see that people around and on the table said, excuse me, what are these strange sounds that you're doing? And so he got an opportunity to explain his ideas of Edie. He does very textured works with a lot of letters, mostly recognizable letters from the Roman alphabet on them.
Is there a picture of him in your,
Yeah, he's,
maybe people would like
I
that.
think he's Fettuccine, this is Angelo. His lovely voice. But he has also become the most web savvy, I'd say. And he does beautiful photographs on the web. I'm going to pass around 3 of them, where he has included layers of images with letters. Now, I mentioned in a lecture last night that one of the things for me that is really evocative about this kind of work is that even though you can't read or understand what the letters are saying, these letters that we know come from a written language, to us they say there's a meaning. You may not be reading it, but there's a meaning. And it just gives a vibration to me of that additional meaning. And he's done it very beautifully, and he's accomplished in one of them, you'll see here, another of the goals of all poets and artists, male poets and artists, and that is to include the women in your work. And so here are 3 pieces by Angelo with different levels of the photographic imagery and letters in it.
You're saying these are all superimposed on each other, or?
Right, it looks like he's using Photoshop with layers,
Oh,
and so you'll see that the several images blended together. And I don't know if this is an appropriate way to wind up my remarks, but I have a collection here of things that I saw the first time I visited Bertozzi's apartment in Rome, and I guess it's his family home in Rome, and then he works across the peninsula of Pescara and has the main residence there. But in this home in Rome, there are some ancient amphora. Apparently, Italian law allows you to keep them if they were excavated before a certain time. So he's got these things that ought to be in a museum. And then he's got a collection of, he's fascinated with writing instruments, pens, inks, brushes, and so forth. So you can see that the whole production of the visual artwork and poetry is in his blood. But there's also a sort of rogue gallery. We had lunch at Jake's today, thanks for the recommendation. And all on the walls there were photographs of, signed by the Blue Angels and different political and entertainment figures. For Bertozzi, it's pictures of him with members of the Futurist movement, the Lettrist movement, all the currents of European literature, so that he's kind of saying, we know where we come from, but we're going off into the future. And so that's inism today, and so the future is all of us. Indeed, we might well have said that we've just now accomplished an EE performance that you were part of, because the whole concepts of it were put into the air and it was built. Thank you very much. Now here's, if you want to look at these signatures, it's an interesting package. Any questions?
So, Bertozzi, What was Bertuzzi's relationship with the futurist movement? Is that something that goes back, or is it?
Well, he was older than the futurist. He has a page there where Cantungo, one of the futurists, did a little drawing for him. But futurism had really ended way before Bertuzzi's time.
Right. Okay.
And so,
So in his house, it's like pictures of him and old guys.
yeah, exactly. And in some of these, he's very young. It would be like me having my picture with Bill Clinton to show my heritage as a Democrat. And it's the same thing for Bertuzzi and all these writers.
Because Bill Clinton's a vegan.
But he's a vegan? Oh, because he's an Edie.
And now regarding the Lettrism, is there a relationship between Lettrism and situationism? I mean, is there what are the origins of Lettrism? Because you didn't talk about that.
No, my focus was intentionally on Edie tonight, but letterism and situationism is one of those thorns in the side of the lettrists, because when the lettrist movement began, let's say around 1950, they actually went to a Cannes Film Festival with a movie, a fairly provocative movie with some of their new ideas, and it was seen by Guy Debord, who became the leader of situationism, and he said, oh, that's cool, I want to be with you guys. And so he participated for about a year with the lettrists, and then he produced one work that was published in a common journal, his film script. But then he wanted to go off on his own. He started what was called international lettrism, and that didn't last very long. You can imagine the stress. And so finally, situationism came out of that. And situationism became much better known than lettrism, to the chagrin of the lettrists. But
Are there other
what can you say?
prominent letterists that are people that are spurned letterists? I mean, is there anyone else that we know that were letterists that moved on to form their own movements as a community?
No, lettrism, I think, is intriguing to study from this standpoint, that there were people who had been with them and broke off, Volman and Mark O, his name he went by, some other artists, but the core group of lettrism, they stayed together partly by being Parisian. And so the center of the movement was in Paris, meaning they could have a regular meeting in cafes. And during a certain period of time, I was part of that. You'd go to a cafe, and what would happen there was you would touch base, people would talk about exhibitions that they were going to organize, say, send us your artworks. They never said, here's what I've done. They never said, what are the theories, what are the new ideas, because all of that came from one person, the Isidore Izu, the founder. Now, he has some name recognition in the States. He did this famous movie that was scandalous at Cannes called Treatise on Jewel and Eternity. Just a title that they made up in order to provoke people. The movie is basically pictures of Vizu walking around in the Latin Quarter, and then him narrating his theories. Kind of dull. So there's a separate soundtrack from the visuals, and that was one of their ideas, is that they call it disjunctive theater or cinema, where the soundtrack could be entirely separate. And then they were so poor they didn't have enough film to make a full going to film, and so they just took stock footage from, you know, Army demonstration films and whatever, patched them in, and then started the technique of pouring Clorox or whatever on them, or scratching on them, so that you had all these distorted visuals as well. And they promoted that as the idea of we are challenging. And you know, I don't want to belittle the effort. They were really challenging standard Hollywood film, which was the standard at the time. And so,
Really natural.
well, the term wasn't used at the time, but in fact, Stan Breakage said that he learned some things from them and went on in his own direction. Lettrism, I think, touched and influenced a bunch of people who wouldn't say that that's on their resume, but the ideas were out there, especially if you were in France. And again, that's a limitation. The lettrists embraced me because they thought I would make them popular in the United States. I failed, I guess. But I'm still working on a book on lettrism. Unfortunately, a book in which I can say the movement has run its course, and you know, now we can talk about it.
Right away, don't you think the situation, that's the reason that they became widely known, is because they had English speakers as part of their group, like Ralph Romney, and that English art school teachers, professors, and students, you know, they could connect with it, and then in the United States, because we speak English, we could connect.
Well, and their connection to the uprising of '68, which is like, became like this really interesting thing that a lot of people wanted to learn about, right?
Right. But I think the whole idea that there was, when I was looking for material in the 80s, I could find a lot of situationist material in English. I couldn't, it was very rare to find any lettrist material in English.
Exactly. The war coming to the States was definitely the crucial developmental thing.
But
there.
in Portland, what's interesting is that a professor at Lewis and Clark College, Pietro Ferrua, sponsored the first international symposium on letterism and published the proceedings of the.
Yeah, he published the proceedings, and this is something I'd like to refer to also, in terms of promoting a movement like this. Part of the advantage that inism has is that they are, Bertozzi, the leader, is a professor at the University of Pescara. He has some university funding behind him, and they publish a journal. And so it's the journal dedicated to inismo, published by the university there. And so he can put out smart-looking documents. And the proceedings, I went on interlibrary loan and got these proceedings at that letterist convention. They are mimeographed pages, one side of the paper, and bound with gummy binding on the side. It had, the one that they sent to me, actually had an original hand-tinted watercolor print by Lou
I think the
Matlock.
originals had the plastic foam.
Yeah, and I looked at it and photocopied it, and then sent the work back to the Special Collections Department at San Diego, was the place that had that, and said, look, you've got something here that's a little more valuable than just sending it out on interlibrary loan. And so, but the actual...
Wait, do we believe him? Did he actually send the original?
Wait, did he steal it?
No, I didn't.
He says he sent it back, but
I sent it back, I told the Special Collections about it, but
Did the photocopy go back?
That's what I'm wondering.
didn't say that. No, and my 5-point plan does not include. So, well, heck, I was once, as a graduate student, I was working on relations between painting and poetry, and went into the manuscript section of the National Library and asked for Victor Hugo's sketchbooks, because he had said some things about how he's a poet and a painter, and they brought me his sketchbooks. Not all of the pages were attached, and some fell down in front of me. At that time, they didn't even ask me to wear cotton gloves to handle the works. This was back in the 60s. And I put the blue sketch back in the book, turned it, I swear I did. So that was even more valuable than Le Maitre, but having it in my hands was an unforgettable experience. But my point was that in spite of Lumet's work, the rest of the document looked like some of the student literary magazines we put out in the 60s and 70s. It was not.
You didn't like it because I think that you asked me for a copy and I got a copy for you from Pietro. And now you're telling me that you don't like it.
It's strange that you would see in any person disparaging the king of any USA on his home turf like this.
Well, I just think part of this is actually
I mean,
a
it's just funny. I mean, he's saying basically
this
that
isn't any. This is a letterist document.
yeah, but he's also saying that it was
But
crap.
if you understand
Geez,
letterism, the combination of the poor quality of the document, but the high quality of the ideas, it's just like life is a combination of good and bad. And that's, I don't think the letterists were worried about, just like I'm not worried, about the quality of the binding and the publication. They're thinking more about the artwork and the ideas. in
I
the
can attest to
publication.
that because I have a couple of Paul's books here, and they do.
Which actually, I would like to give away if anyone here
Paul has
would
some-
like some actual innocent.
But my point is that this is an artist with his artwork. This is not a movement trying to promote its ideas with a publication. And so,
Sorry for the thing, but your main point is that like inism, the strength of inism is, please get in there. The strength of inism is it some academic backing making it look so fancy.
uh,
No, they were about
okay, to defend myself a little bit into the realities of it, after the last debate,
That's great that you know the molecule, that means a lot.
Are there regular scheduled debates within INISMO?
after the last presidential debate, Obama said Romney's performance was not leadership, it was salesmanship. And yet people said that Romney won the debate. And
People
from,
always say that.
from
People always say that about the white guy. That's because we live in a racist country.
yeah,
So
but
I still have like.
it's always what they say about the French guy too. You know, they just,
Well, Lambert's not actually French. You know, he's from here.
yeah, he's not part of my criticism. No,
Actually, I wasn't trying to
he's
be
part
critical.
of the more highly polished inismo.
I would like to also add something, this is totally my own opinion, but I think one reason the letterists did not take hold here in the United States is that during their meetings, they all dressed entirely in black and they chain smoked. And there is no longer any place in this country where you can go in a public place and chain smoke for several hours at a time.
God, we can still wear flannel.
Yeah, so.
Well,
Watch out, they're coming for you too.
Oh, I know.
well, actually, Yes,
It was
it
just
had-
my personal
right.
observation of why the letters didn't really get a toehold in the United
Right.
States.
Here's another thing, is that I think a movement can be carried by its ideas and art shows, etc. But in both lettrism and in ini, I see one person who stands out from the others as being very attractive because he makes beautiful works. And I think that Mirante is beginning to play that role in ini. There's an ini Facebook page where these images come from with his elegant photographs, and my printouts don't do them justice at all. There was a similar person in lettrism, Alain Satier, who has beautiful paintings, sculptures, works that fit within it, but he's way ahead of the others in terms of having appeal and doing saleable works. He also died of lung cancer, and
The result of all those
the
meetings.
result of all those chain smoking meetings, and so
But also,
that's just an observation.
aren't all these, I mean, there aren't a lot of groups, I mean, post-war avant-garde groups that kind of sprang from surrealism. I mean, you can kind of, there's a genealogy of, for the surrealism of Henri Breton, the letterism, to inismo. I mean, there's not a lot of other tentacles out there. Is that
Yeah,
right?
well,
Or is that, maybe that's a misconception that
No,
maybe there's thousands of them.
You're absolutely right, and bringing up surrealism allows me to also say, what surrealist artist do you think of when you think of surrealism? For most people, it'll be Salvador Dali, the most accomplished and
Well marketed.
well marketed. Yeah, the Breton, who's do you know any works by Breton? You know Andre Breton, the name, the primary figure, but he rejected Salvador Dali. They did an anagram of his name and called him Avid of Dollars, because he had this commercial success. And so there's, again, these are observations. I don't know where I'm going with it, but it's an interesting thing to observe in these movements. And
Well, it's how much the movement becomes a part of popular culture, and the letterists really never did.
okay, now that's a point that I would challenge, because we talked last night about the cycle of revolutions, and artistic revolutions are no different from political revolutions, where you have a period of turmoil, and then you have a strong dictator leading the movement, and then finally things calm down, and when they calm down, you see the artworks in museums. When they calm down, their techniques are adapted for advertising. And I've got a whole file full of letterist-inspired advertising, whereas the advertisers maybe didn't know of this directly, but something was in the air, getting the idea that you take shaped like an absolute vodka bottle, but it's all made up of words.
Okay, but big word. I mean, seriously, Sesame Street would have been the natural place for the letterists to have made inroads. And did they?
That's right, we should have had lettrism for children. I'll get a little silly with this, but not too
Well, it's
far off.
interesting. In the digital realm, there's this guy who's an archaeologist, I forget where he is, but he's like a digital archaeologist. And he created this thing initially called Digino that was first made out of the university, and then they refined it. And it's basically all this data and information about how the web is, the machine is kind of using us,
No, but I know that Izu claims hypergraphics, the term, as his term.
This guy's.
Wait, I never even heard that
Or
term.
something, and, anyway, it's all this really interesting use of text and manipulation of text.
Letters were very hostile.
Wait, to
No.
prove that the robots actually control our minds?
Well, actually, it's a really interesting archaeological excavation from, an academic standpoint about what is happening with digital culture. The guy's name is Michael Welch. Yeah. I think University of Kansas or something. And he's just done all these interesting things. And then you've seen a whole movement in, motion graphics and all that stuff where people are manipulating text to varying degrees, making it
Yeah, yeah. This thing I
Where
was
like you're
thinking,
holding
though,
your phone and they're looking at you, or they give you a piece of pie and there's like a GPS in the pie and it can follow you wherever you go.
just like that.
Is that letrist inspired?
It might
No,
be.
but I was-
That sounds more like
It might be.
Edie.
what I wanted to say about the letterists was that Izu and Lemaitre were very hostile. They would issue diatribes against other French artists, and they would use, to me it seemed humorous because it was so negative. They would use terms like that these other French writers or poets were necrophiliacs and that they were stealing the ideas of the dead. They just, this situationist, the Guy Debord gradually kicked everyone out and then committed suicide. And to me, I'm a more optimistic person. I always got a kick out of this, what I call this negativity of these French groups. I always thought that's great groups. This is great to kick everyone out and then commit suicide,
It does have a certain appeal.
Yeah, so I don't know about the Muppets, if they would ever connect with directly, it would be a really roundabout.
Kick,
Thanks.
kick
about the
everyone
fruits.
out. Fruits.
Yeah,
Yeah.
drop.
Y'all have any additional thoughts, responses? What do you think? What do you suppose is the future of a movement like Edie that's trying to do non-traditional things in all the media? One thing, can it be a movement if they can't get
But-
together in one room?
I have a question, and that is, but in and around country poetry, non-controversial poetry, and in the realm of physical objects, which I really love small press and man-made objects, with, the combination of the visual and the textual, in the realm of digital, where we are moving off of them, obviously there are a lot more than others, there is a space for